the stressors of the Wayfarer insurrection and all of that caused a radical faction to take power on Mars. Sure, like the Draconists took power on Callisto in the early 2320s. And this radical faction was called the One Mars Party. And they're basically...
They want to make Mars great again.
Basically, yes. They're basically, when I created the One Mars Party, it was basically an analogy to the Tea Party. And because of that, Mars started taking a more hardline stance on its ownership of outer system resources, which didn't sit well with the warlords of Titan, who were, again, this I think we discussed in the Titan episode that we did a while back, or a few episodes back. The warlords of Titan were sort of the outgrowth of the big families that ran the Commonwealth of Titan. They'd become sort of glutted with their own wealth and power. And now you've got a situation that's basically like Europe in 1914 or 1913. You've got these two powers, because you've got these two factions that are ruled by basically hardliner, sort of pseudo monarchist, rich people.
So so you've got sort of a real radical nationalist movement that has been elected into power on Mars, who wants to make Mars great again. And then you've got a bunch of
finance it with outer system wealth.
And then you've got, which in turn, the wealth they want to finance it with is taken or will affect the oligarchs, the gangs, the people that run the outer system, Titan, sort of, how did you put it? There's families of like,
yeah, they're basically like, I think I numbered it at 6 families, but they're basically like the 5 families of the Cosa Nostra in New York. It's basically it's kind of a combination of like the houses in Game of Thrones and like the 5 families in New York.
Because Mars has always been, outside of Earth, Mars has always been the big dominant player of solar space.
Exactly.
Where kind of like in our reality, our timeline, you can, if the United States says do this and you say no, depending on how far away you are, the United States might not do anything. But so Mars is like that. So Mars can do anything, but Mars can't do everything.
Yeah.
So now did Project Wayfarer, which was the colonization effort for Alpha Centauri, which was kind of a vanity project by these Jeff Bezos types. None of the people who were doing Project Wayfarer were involved in there. None of the Titan oligarchs are involved in the Project Wayfarer people. That's 2 separate groups of oligarchs.
The oligarchs who did Project Wayfarer would be like inner system oligarchs, or maybe like asteroid belt oligarchs at the farthest, if the farthest from the sun you would get, probably, for those people, because again, they're the ones, because it's kind of like the only analogy I can think of, and I don't know why this comes to mind, but it's like the old Chris Rock joke where he talks about the difference between wealth and rich, and between being rich and being wealthy. The guys on Titan are rich. They have enough money to rule Titan and basically throw their weight around and build up a militia to sort of control the outer solar system. The guys on Earth and Mars, or maybe not Earth, because again, we've talked about Earth, the guys on Mars and Ceres and those other places, they're wealthy. Yeah. They basically control the purse strings of the entire solar system. The problem is the guys on Mars and Ceres want to make themselves more wealthy by taking the riches of the outer system oligarchs, and the outer system oligarchs, for obvious, basically obvious reasons, don't want to let that happen. That's where you got the conflict.
Okay, so what's the relation of the oligarchs to the local government? Like, is there a government in function that pretends to be democratic but is kind of ran by the oligarchs?
On Titan, yes. That's basically what it is. The Commonwealth of Titan in, say, circa 2280 or 2290, which is a couple of years before the Mars-Titan War, which, again, we'll get to. They're basically they're a slightly more functional version of, say, the Russian Federation, where you've basically got a government that works. I'm using air quotes, but it's basically run by a few rich people who do what they want, and if you don't like it, well, you're not going to have a very good time.
Yeah, you get a bolt to the head. I get it.
Yeah, essentially. Again, there you go down that dark path,
I
but
noticed that. I was thinking about that the other day. Um, I think at your core, you're kind of a guy who just wants everyone to be okay, and you don't want anything bad to happen to anybody.
I'm an optimist.
And yeah, and when I'm like, oh, we should just torture our characters, like just, and you're like, well, no, man, like these are my, like in that sense of you wanting to um make
Protect my
sure everyone
children.
around you is okay. Like like you as a person, you as a social creature, you definitely want to make sure everyone is okay. And I love how that extends to your characters as well. And I, on the other hand, want to torture, uh, just put all of my slash our characters uh, through the ringer, just to like mine the depths of sadness to find the truth of the human condition.
Well,
Like,
it's funny you say that because to a certain extent, I like to torture my characters, but it has to make sense to me. It's
yeah,
weird. My stepdad has talked about this. Like my stepdad has criticized me before about how, like, when we're watching about the difference between me watching a war movie and like me watching, say, a horror movie. Because
yeah,
say you watch The Descent or something where these characters are just being fucking put through the ringer, as you say, for an hour and a half or whatever. I hate it because I'm like, well, there's no reason for them to be suffering.
yeah.
But at the same time, if I watch Saving Private Ryan, those characters are being put through the emotional and physical ringer for 2.5 hours. And I'm like, oh, this is fine. It's war. It makes sense.
It
It's like
makes
that. It's like that fucking quote from Heath Ledger as the Joker, where he says, if you say that a truckload of soldiers will die, will get blown up by a bomb, nobody panics. But if you say one little mayor will be killed, well, then everyone loses their minds. It's the semantics of what you can wrap your head around, which is, I guess, just kind of an odd thing about me.
well, it's not an odd. I mean, it's something I like about you. I think I like to think that you,
I guess I justify that war is ugly and
yeah,
regular life doesn't have to be ugly.
yeah. And I'm like, oh yeah, I know regular life is ugly. War is uglier. Regular life is sometimes really nice, but sometimes. Um,
Anyway,
anyway,
about that Mars Titan war.
back to that Mars Titan war.
We haven't even talked about the inciting incident yet.
What you got? Hit me.
Because the thing is with all of this tense atmosphere that we've been discussing, with all of the tension between Mars and Titan and the inner system and the outer system, so to speak, you then have this thing, what's called the Ramayana or Ramayana. I can't remember how you pronounce it. It's a Hindu word. There's the Ramayana artifacts, which are discovered on Titan. And what that is in the early, I want to say the early 2280s. So about 2281, I think they're revealed to the public in like 2282, if I remember my lore correctly, my own lore correctly. There's this cavern basically discovered on Titan. And by investigating this cavern, they discover that Titan is riddled all over with subterranean alien ruins that are like 500 million years old. And by investigating these ruins, they realize, oh, we can learn all sorts of things about science and technology. And this means that Titan goes from a place that has riches that Mars wants to the location in the solar system, because now you've got this like literal, like tangible resource, which is this wealth of alien artifacts.
Because that is greed. That is the bloodshed that greed will get. So yes, I'm sorry. You're saying something. Go.
No, you're fine. I agree, because that's the thing. It basically means that Titan has a massive bargaining chip. And when
Yep.
you have a bargaining chip, it's not just the kind of bargaining chip that you can like make deals with. It's the kind of bargaining chip that other people want to steal. So Mars is now like, hey, we wanted to like control your resources. Now we want to control your whole world. We
Yeah.
want you like a patron state of us, so that we can so we can control the research of these artifacts. And of course, Titan doesn't acquiesce to that request. and that leads to about a decade of tension and rising tensions and so on and so forth. And that in turn is what sparks the Mars, basically the falling out between Mars and Titan. Eventually, they stop having diplomatic relations. They start pointing fingers at each other. They start building up their respective militaries. Titan forms what's called the Titan Pact, which is kind of like the Warsaw Pact, except it's for the outer solar system. It's kind of an early predecessor to the Alliance of Free Worlds. It wasn't quite as effective or as populous because it was earlier. And Mars and Ceres form the Intersystem Coalition or something like that. I can't remember what I called it, but there's a name for it. And they start facing each other down across no man's land, just like NATO and the Warsaw Pact are doing, or I'm sorry, NATO and the Shanghai Pact are doing on the moon in 2040 in the 2040s, just like the ICA and the Alliance will be doing in the 2370s and 80s. And in 2294, then you have the conflagration, because there's an event that, if I remember our lore correctly, there's like a bombing of the ICA compound. There's like an attack on the ICA headquarters compound on Mars, and it's never quite clear if it was carried out by Titan Pact sympathizers or Titan Pact agents exclusively, or if it was sort of like a false flag incident. But it's basically the inciting incident that causes Mars to say, "Hey, we're going to war now," and they then launch into a campaign against the Titan Pact, and that leads to 5 years of interplanetary conflict, which is at that point basically the biggest, metaphorically and literally the biggest conflict in human history, because it takes place across probably billions of miles of space, or billions of kilometers of space, and dozens of worlds, and involves tens of millions of people. So yeah.
Okay. And with the Commonwealth of Titan, now that sounds, at least on paper, like a functioning governmental body, even though it's kind of behind the scenes ran by oligarchs. I'm assuming they have a military.
Yes, they have the, oh man, what did I call it? I think it's like the Titan militia or something like that.
Something like
outer
that.
system, like the outer system militia. Because remember, it's the Titan Pact. It's not just Titan. It's also some other worlds that sort of tacked their banner onto the banner of Titan and said, "Hey, we're going to go with you because we don't like Mars either."
So is this mostly Mars trying to occupy Titan? Does Titan have a fleet to fight back with?
Yes, they do. That's the thing. That's what makes this unique to the Draconis Wars, for example. The Draconis stole ships and stuff and kind
Yeah.
of had a fleet, but they were mostly like a pirate flotilla.
Yeah.
The Titan Pact actually had a functioning military. They weren't maybe as big as, say, like the military of the Alliance. The military of Mars wouldn't be as big in the 2290s as it was in the 2380s or whatever, because it's just the it's the law of growth. It's the law of exponential growth, to be honest. But and then basically the thing is the ICA worked with Mars. That this is the start of Martian dominance of the ICA, because before the Mars Titan War, Mars played a big part in the ICA, and especially the Spacer Corps as well, but it was just another part. But with the advent of the Mars Titan War, Mars basically said, "Hey, we're going to be like the arbiter, the first and last arbiter of decisions in the ICA and the Spacer Corps." And like we've talked about before, by the 2380s, when the Frontier Wars are happening, like 1 in 5 people in the Spacer Corps is born on Mars.
Yeah. So you've got these are precursor artifacts they find.
Yes.
And now, did we say that these Zorns are augmented by the precursor artifacts, or that the Zorns just see the precursors and they're sort of like religious capacity?
They see him as kind of a religious capacity, because they think that the Zarans believe that the precursors were like non-biological beings, which we probably discuss in a future episode where we discuss the precursors and other ancient lore and such. But the Zarans see the precursors as being like, "Hey, these are like our forebears. We worship them."
Yeah.
I think if I get what you're, if I can sense where you're probably going with this, that's part of why the Zarns lump themselves in with the Titan Pact, because they're basically like, hey, we want to be with Titan, because Titan is where like it's basically like where the templates, it's, the quote from Horatius, it's the temples of our gods, you know,
That
and
makes sense.
yeah.
And that's probably why Titan links up with some super smart Zarn to help them run their war effort, right?
Yes, there's an AI program construct called Horus,
Yeah.
which basically styles itself after the ancient Egyptian god of knowledge, which again tells you everything you need to know about its ego. And that as the Titanian, because again, the Titanians don't win this war. We've already discussed that. That's a known
Yep.
fact in our lore. The Titanian, the Commonwealth of Titan and the Titan Pact lose the Mars Titan War, and they're forced to like pay reparations. Basically, they become sort of a pariah state, and that's what eventually leads, in many ways, to the Draconis Wars. But going back to the Mars Titan War, when the war starts turning against them in say 2296 or 97 especially, they shack up with this kind of egomaniacal crazy AI called Horus, which they think will help them facilitate a victory. It's kind of like the ultimate Wunder weapon, Wunder weapon, to use the old phrase from Germany in World War II. It's basically like if instead of building V2 bombs, the Germans had created a supercomputer that helped try to run their war effort in 1944 or so. And the problem is Horus, in its infinite egomaniacal, sadism, says, "Hey, I'm going to win the war by directing you to like send waves of your people against the enemy, or like dropping small moons on big moons to like destroy enemy fortifications, which then of course also kills all of the civilians up there." So it's not really an ideal situation. That's part of what makes Titan a pariah state after the war, because they sided with this like maniacal AI.
That makes a
That's
lot
of
of
course,
sense.
and that's also what
That
makes
makes a
AI
lot
a
of
pariah.
sense. What'd you say?
And that's also what makes AI a pariah, just like we've talked about in our episodes about like the ALCA and such.
That makes a lot of sense because why they would be so unforgiving to the Titans after the war, because it would be like giving ChatGPT the nuclear codes.
Yeah.
Like, and yeah, that's a great justification for it. And that's a great justification as well for why people are so anti-Zarn. I love that. Um, Take it back to the wafer project a bit. So you piqued my interest there on that as well. So they make it to Alpha Centauri.
Yes. The Alpha Centauri project is actually successful. They established a settlement there of about, I want to say it's about 6,400 people, because that's split between the four ships. And from there, they start growing. And basically, after the initial setup of the colony starts growing exponentially, which was to the point that to jump ahead a few eras in our storyline, in the 2560s, which is when infinitum is set, that we've talked about, I think maybe not in an episode yet, but certainly in future episodes, and which is another era of the Space Saga universe. There are like 100 million people living in the Alpha Centauri cluster, which
Interesting.
again, because we got to remember there's 3 stars in Alpha Centauri. So, that's one thing we have to make clear, is it's not just Alpha Centauri. There's also Alpha Centauri. There's Alpha Centauri A, Alpha Centauri B, and Proxima Centauri, and they all have
Okay.
names. I think it's like Rigel, Centaurus, Ptolemy, and then Proxima.
Okay. And
And basically that's the story that becomes a story in and of itself. And the story of Infinitum, the Martian Federation, is trying to basically take the Alpha Centauri system, Alpha Centauri cluster, as a colonial possession. That's like a big part of the story that we talked about in that timeline. But again, that's for a future episode, most likely.
that is definitely for a future episode. And I'm glad to bring that point up because at least for this first initial run of world building episodes, I kind of feel like we've covered we've covered Petrichor, which would be considered probably the lunar, the lunar war, uh, because a lot of your stuff is focused around major conflicts, which makes perfect sense. But
Oh yeah, I
like,
make no secret. The Spatial Saga is basically a military sci-fi.
oh yeah, is the Mars Titan War kind of seen as the first of the frontier wars?
In a way, yes. I mean, if it's not seen as the first of the frontier wars, it's definitely seen as like the arbiter, the not the arbiter. It's seen as the predecessor to the frontier wars
Okay.
because again, there's kind of there's an analogy that I've used. I don't know if analogy is the right word, but there's a thought structuring tool that I've used in my writing before, which basically what a person in any particular period of the Spacer Saga would refer to as the war with a capital W. For people in the 2050s and 2060s, the war would be the Lunar War because that's basically World War III.
Mhm.
For people in the 2300s and 2310s, the war would be the Mars Titan War. For people after that, it would be the Draconist Wars, and then for people in like the 2370s and 80s, it would be the Frontier Wars. It basically, again, it's like we talked about before. It's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of what are you looking at as the big conflict, which kind of brings us back around to what we said a minute ago, how a lot of these stories are centered around major conflicts. The Mars Titan War is basically the inciting incident to a lot of history and basically the whole history of the 24th century. Because from 2020, 2294, 2299, you've got the Mars Titan War. Then in 2301, you've got the Harrison Accord, which is kind of like setting the stage for the political scene of the 24th century. And that's what leads to the Draconist Wars, which lead directly to the Frontier Wars.
And I think we'll end there. For the Blanket Fortress of Solitude, I am Derwin,
And I'm Nick.
and we will see you next Monday morning at 0700.